Hello and welcome to this interview by ThePrint. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and I'm going to be talking to you about a new book called India's Finance Ministers From Independence to Emergency, which covers the period 1947 to 1977. It's an in-depth look at all of our first 10 finance ministers, what policies they brought in, what were their dynamics with the prime ministers of the time, with the RBI, what were the economic policies they enacted, and what the conditions were. And it's very, very deeply researched, but it's actually not dense like an academic book would be. And the reason for that is that the author is actually a veteran journalist, and so he's brought the journalistic brevity and sharp analysis to the book. And we have him with us. It's Mr. AK Bhattacharya, who's a veteran of the Indian financial journalism landscape, and currently he is the editorial director of Business Standard. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Sharad, for being so kind and generous with your words.
Of course, sir. So, sir, number one, I'm going to go chronologically, more or less, just as the book has gone.
Sure.
And second, I'm going to try to link some of my questions to the current times, because history, of course, a lot of times it informs the present day. So I would start with independent India's first finance minister, Mr. Shanmugam Chetty. He was not from the Congress, even though it was a Congress government. Now, do you think that is something that can be, worked out even now? Is the political system capable of bringing in an outside expert to be the finance minister?
Unfortunately, my answer to this question of yours will be no at this point in time. But the situation and the extent of the economic crisis that India has faced over the last many years has seen not just one or two or even three finance ministers who did not come necessarily from the fold of the ruling party.
Right.
Shanmugam Chetty, of course, is the first example. Then there were many other finance ministers, and the most recent finance ministers who did not come from the original fold of the party is Manmohan Singh. In 1991, when Narasimha Rao got Manmohan Singh to become the finance minister of the country, to take on the country's worst balance of payments and fiscal indiscipline problem, it was not a congressman.
Correct.
Manmohan Singh was a professional economist. Yes, of course, he had worked with the government many years. He was with the UGC as the chairman at that point in time. He has advised many prime ministers, finance ministers in different capacities. He had been the governor of RBI, but he was not from the Congress. So
he was the chief economic advisor also.
Even also chief economic advisor.
Right.
So it was possible probably till the 1990s, or if India faces a major economic crisis, God forbid, then I would imagine the political leadership, even in today's India, might think twice and say that, okay, if you want to take on this economic policy challenge, this crisis, then forget about your party affiliation, that the finance minister must come from your own party. Let us get hold of an independent expert and make him the finance minister. 1947 was a different era. It was a new government, new country, independent, and at that point in time, what happened was the leadership, which is Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel, they realized that they need to have a face which can present India's case in international forums.
Right.
At the same time, take on the partition challenge. And partition challenge was a huge economic challenge at the point in time. So they decided that why should we only take people from the Congress? As a matter of fact, there were leaders in the Union Council of Ministers of Nehru, where many people were from different political parties or different political affiliations. Shanmugam Chetty was certainly one of them.
Right, sir. And so now do you feel like as India has grown and it has progressed and kind of become a more heavyweight on the global scene, have our politicians acquired an ability to represent India's interests on a global scene, as you had mentioned? Can they do that now much more rather than bringing outside help to do that for us?
Today, certainly, given the level of competence of the economic community, in a sense that the economists or the economic administrators, I think the finance minister is aided and helped by the advisors. If you look at the finance ministry even now, you will see right from the finance secretary to many other bureaucrats or the chief economic advisor, the finance minister gets the best advice, almost the best advice available in the country. So the finance minister is aided and helped in that manner. Shanmugam Chetty was the first finance minister of a newly independent country. He could not have relied on the kind of advice that today's finance ministers enjoy.
Of course. And that actually leads me to another question. You have dealt with the finance minister, the union finance ministers in your book, but what about the ministers of state? Did they play an important part back then? Because now I see that their role is not quite as important.
It's a very important question that you have raised. The relationship and the role that are usually assigned to the ministers of state for finance raises many questions. It is true that ministers of state for finance rarely get an opportunity or a chance to show their mettle, so to say. So much so that there have been occasions, and I think in this book I have dealt with at least 2 occasions where the government of the day, the Prime Minister, wanted to split finance ministry into 2.
Oh wow!
They wanted the revenue department to be independent. I mean, the proposal was made to Morarji Desai, and Morarji Desai shot it down. And that was also a different era, that a finance minister could say, either you give me the finance ministry in its complete form and shape, don't split it, then I am not interested in becoming a finance minister
at all.
So I think unfortunately the role and responsibilities of the Minister of State of Finance is not meaty enough. So they rather play the role of somebody is going along with what the finance minister does, does some administrative work, clearing files, but in terms of policy making, it is the finance minister.
Right, absolutely. And so now coming to our second finance minister, Mr. John Mathai, he was an economist.
Yeah.
And now currently we have an economist finance minister after a very long time. I think since Manmohan Singh was finance minister, this is the first economist finance minister we have. Now, do you feel that the role needs an economist, or do you feel that, the lawyers, accountants, civil servants who have previously held the role, they are also able to do it?
Being an economist certainly helps.
Okay.
There is no doubt about it. If you are Sachindra Chaudhary, who was the Minister of Finance when India devalued its currency by a whopping 57% in 1966, he was not in economics, he was a trained lawyer. Now, it helps the political establishment to effect a decision of that nature, where people like I.G. Patel or Bhutalingam or B.K. Nehru are around, and they can help the finance minister go along the path of devaluation without much damage to the economy. So, if you have a finance minister who is an economist at this point in time, it certainly helps. But I don't think not being an economist is a disadvantage. Take the example of P. Chidambaram, who is not a trained economist, he is also a trained lawyer. He has been one of India's better finance ministers.
I see. And of course, as you said, that there is a team that is supporting them.
Absolutely.
And their training, education and expertise, of course, always helps.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Mathai also was the person who brought in the planning commission. And Could you tell us a little bit about what the thinking at the time was, why they needed a planning commission, and does that thinking no longer apply now? Because one of the first things the Modi government did was to do away with the planning commission.
Well, the need for the planning commission arose because Jawaharlal Nehru, the prime minister at that time, realized that he needs an advisory body who could provide inputs to economic policy making.
Right.
And there was Prashant Chandra Mahalanobis, whose advice was considered very important by the Prime Minister at the time. He was a good friend of the Prime Minister, and he also helped the Prime Minister shape up the idea of setting up the Planning Commission. As a matter of fact, the idea of the Planning Commission was actually supported also by a man who later on became the Finance Minister, C.D. Deshmukh.
Right.
Now, C.D. Deshmukh gave proper shape to the idea of the Planning Commission as a consultative economic policy advisory body for the government, which is why it is not an adjunct of the Finance Ministry.
Right.
It is the chairman of that Planning Commission was Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, the Finance Minister at that time, Mr. Mathai, was not very happy about the idea. His objection was that when you set up a body like that, you may end up undermining the authority of the Finance Ministry.
I see.
And the chief economic advisor at that time. So he did not like the idea, but like a true democrat, he went along with the decision.
Okay.
The only budget that he presented, he announced the formation of the Planning Commission, and after his budget presentation a few days later, he put in his resignation.
I see.
He quit the government primarily because of his sharp differences of opinion over the question of setting up the Planning Commission.
Right.
Now, those are the days when a finance minister could quit the government on a principle like that.
Right.
Why Planning Commission was wound up is in 2015 January is of course a different set of reasons, because the government at that time under Mr. Narendra Modi recognized that they needed a different kind of a body, not an advisory body to the Prime Minister.
And possibly could the same reasons that Mr. Mathai had, that it might undermine the Finance Minister and the Chief Economic Advisor, might that have also played a role?
In the dissolution of the Planning
Yes.
Commission in 2015, I don't think Planning Commission was any threat to the governments in the past many years after it was formed in 1952.
Right.
And I don't think it was that could be the reason why Planning Commission was wound up. If you look at the performance of the Planning Commission, they were very happy doing preparing the plans, the 5-year plans. They were very happy doing the consultation between states and the center for allocation of resources, but they were never a stumbling block to policy making,
Right.
or nor were they undermining the role of the Finance Ministry in the last many years.
Right. And now you mentioned Mr. C.D. Deshmukh. He was he became India's finance minister after having been governor of the RBI. Now, currently, our governor of the RBI is a former finance secretary. So now, do you feel that to smoothen out relations between the two, because in the book you've also mentioned several times when they have locked horns, to smoothen relations, is this kind of cross-pollination the way to go?
I think this should not be seen as an idea that must be implemented or perfected. If you get a good person who is capable and he happens to be the RBI governor, and Nehru certainly thought that the best person at that time to handle India's economic policy challenges would be the former RBI governor.
Right.
So he chose him. Just as Narasimha Rao chose Manmohan Singh, who was a former RBI governor.
Right.
So I think the question here is that are you the right person to do that job? When Mr. Arun Jaitley chose Shaktikant Das as the RBI governor, I don't think the fact that he was the Economic Affairs Secretary before he became the Finance Commission member, that thought played a role. The thought that played a role was that Mr. Jaitley wanted RBI governor who knew how the government system works instead of a thoroughbred economist without much experience of India's economic administration and its many complexities.
So then there might be a case for having somebody who has some experience from within the government to then go.
There is no doubt about it. I think C.D. Deshmukh proved that point, that he knew the government system. He was an ICS officer. He had been a district collector. He had dealt with dealt with the bureaucracy. He had dealt with the political leadership. As a matter of fact, I write in this book where how he C.D. Deshmukh actually had to deal with Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel on quite a couple of occasions, even as a secretary in the government.
Right.
So it does help in if you are a former RBI governor or a former officer in the government.
Right. And Mr. Deshmukh also, he did another thing, which was to nationalize the insurance sector and also to bring into the government fold what became the SBI.
Oh, certainly. This fact is not often, appreciated, that C.D. Deshmukh was the finance minister when the first phase of nationalization began.
Right.
It did not begin with Indira Gandhi.
Indira Gandhi, yes.
It began in the 1950s under C.D. Deshmukh's charge, and the job that was given by Nehru to Deshmukh was make sure that it was, he nationalized insurance industry. He nationalized the Imperial Bank of India and made it into a State Bank of India. And I think this work has also begun to nationalize the general insurance industry, but that happened later under Indira Gandhi.
So now, as you said, Indira Gandhi also went on to nationalize all of the banks. What was the thinking then and what's different now? Because the government right now wants to exit business. We're talking about disinvestment from various banks and from across sectors. What has qualitatively changed?
Well, what has changed are primarily the need to encourage the government to acquire or achieve the commanding heights of the economy. When Imperial Bank of India was nationalized, and I have narrated the sequence of developments where there were a series of oppositions and questions. The original shareholders of Imperial Bank of India were not very happy about it. Something similar happened with the insurance sector. Now the entire thing was justified on the ground that the government must get into this business so that economic development from the government side gets a push.
Right.
So once it is under the government's ownership, then development challenges are a little easier to face because you have got the major the economic agents under your control.
Right.
Now that was the philosophy then. Indira Gandhi, when she was briefly the finance minister, actually she made sure that her finance minister Morarji Desai quits before she actually got into the act of nationalizing those 14 banks in 1969. Again, her objective was to have an ownership of those banks so that those banks' resources, credits, loans, everything can be guided towards ensuring that the rural India, the unorganized sector, they all get the kind of financial assistance, the financial support that the country's political leadership wants should happen.
Right.
So that was the political philosophy then. Today it is just in a different direction, you see that even the private banks are willing to go out, and they see the market exists in rural India to a great extent.
Right.
Of course, there is the urban India, the organized sector is also important, but today's private sector banks realize that business. So the government is feeling that why should government's money be blocked or locked in those banks or those public sector companies? So they want to get out. So it is a change of the political ideology, which is primarily responsible for change in mind.
Right. And now, one of the more fascinating and kind of interesting periods that you've talked about, or incidents you talked about, was the tussle between T.T. Krishnamachari and Benegal Ramarao, who was the RBI governor at the time. So, what was that about?
Well, it was a variety of reasons actually. There was I think personality wise, they did not gel very well.
Right.
T.T. Krishnamachari belonged to a business family before he embraced politics and became a Congress minister. But he found Benegal Ramarao a kind of a stumbling block. Some of his proposals on a tax on interest rates.
Right.
Now, the tax on interest rates, Benegal Ramarao as a RBI governor felt was tinkering with monetary policy.
Right.
So he was not very happy about it, and a point came where Benegal Ramarao actually got the central bank's board adopt a resolution.
Yes.
And challenging that finance ministry's decision.
This followed a shouting match that they had, right?
Absolutely, they had a shouting match to which B.K. Nehru was a witness.
Right.
B.K. Nehru was at that time the India's commissioner ambassador in the US.
Right.
Now he had come to visit the finance minister, and then he was witness to this big fight of sort of verbal exchange of words. So when Benegal Ramarao decided that he must get the board to come on his side, and he adopted the resolution, T.T. Krishnamachari could not stomach it. He went and Nehru sided with him. So it is remarkable that the Prime Minister of the country sided with his finance minister in the latter's battle with the RBI governor.
Right.
And actually told the RBI governor that he had crossed his brief. And as a result, Benegal Ramarao was the casualty in a sense that he quit the RBI as a governor, and I think he is still the longest serving governor of RBI.
Of the RBI.
He would have, if he had completed his tenure, he would have had a longer tenure, more than 7 years, I think.
Right. And now, speaking of long terms, apart from C.D. Deshmukh and Moraji Desai, and assuming that FM Nirmala Sitharaman finishes her term, then she will be the third longest finance minister the country has seen if she finishes that term.
Yeah, you are right. You are right. Of course, you have Chidambaram also.
But those are broken up.
Yeah, but Chidambaram also had a 5-year term.
So, right, there's Mr. Chidambaram also.
Mr. Chidambaram also had a 5-year term. That will be exceeded by her if she comes back and again she becomes the finance minister.
So now, has history shown us that this kind of stability is preferable, or that a quick change of leadership in response to a dynamic economy is preferable? Which works out?
I think stability is any day better than the frequent changes of finance ministers that you saw. I will give you a simple piece of statistic. Rajiv Gandhi's 5 years saw 4 finance ministers.
Wow.
Including himself.
Right.
You have started with VP Singh, then it went up to Rajiv Gandhi himself, then went to Narendra Tiwari, then into S.B. Chavan. So in 5 years you have got 4 finance ministers, and you know what happened between 1985 to 1989. India's economy went downhill.
Right.
So therefore, it is very important to have stability in North Block, which is the headquarters of the finance ministry. So you have a C.D. Deshmukh, which we ran a tenure of 5 years, Moraji Desai another 3-4 years together. So I think Nehru was little more understanding of these basic requirements of the stability in the finance ministry
Right.
and continuity of leadership there. But one element of Nehru's dealing with the finance ministry was that he developed differences of opinion with most of his finance ministers, and he worked with 5 finance ministers, and all the 5 finance ministers had to quit.
Right.
I mean, if it was Shanmugam Chetty, there was a difference of opinion over the manner in which Shanmugam Chetty has dealt with a tax inquiry commission
Yes.
brief. If it was John Mathai because of the setting of the planning commission, it was C.D. Deshmukh on the question of the Maharashtra reorganization issue.
Right.
C.D. Deshmukh quit. Morarji Desai because Nehru wanted T.T. Krishnamachari back. And so Morarji Desai was sacrificed thanks to the Kamraj plan, and T.T. Krishnamachari, of course, because of the notorious Mundra scandal, which is the independent India's first major stock market scandal.
Right.
that ended the tenure of T.T. Krishnamachari.
Right. And so now it's not for us to give advice to the government, but if I were to ask you that if the BJP comes back in 2024, then it would make sense to retain the same finance minister just from a stability point of view?
Well, the finance minister's stability, of course, continuity, always these 2 factors have a great advantage. And if you have a finance minister who knows the job, has been doing the job, quite competently, at a time when Indian economy faced many challenges on many fronts. So to continue the same finance minister in the job is certainly will help. But at the same time, change in leadership also brings in fresh thinking.
Right.
And please remember that, and I have tried to show it in this book also, that the job of a finance minister is a highly coveted job.
Absolutely.
So there are political forces, political leaders who are always angling for this job. So whether it was Morarji Desai was called by Nehru and promised the job of a finance minister, but suddenly Morarji Desai got a message from Nehru that sorry, it is not happening, because he had got T.T. Krishnamachari in between.
Right.
So there's a lot of lobbying and jockeying for the post that goes on. So while continuity is an important factor in Mrs. Sitharaman's favor, these factors will also have to be kept in mind before we can take a final call whether she will continue to be the finance minister after 2024.
Of course. And now what you mentioned about how the current finance minister, she's had to deal with a lot of challenging times. Does history tell us anything about how, say, a crisis finance minister, how they then perform once the crisis has ebbed and things become stable again? Do you need a different mindset, or historically have our finance ministers been able to adapt themselves from crisis to peacetime?
There is one factor which is extremely important, and I have seen this since this is just till emergency years, but I have studied the finance ministers, the performance subsequently, which will come out in the subsequent 2 volumes are awaited. A finance minister's relationship and the support he or she enjoys from the Prime Minister is the most important factor in the way whether the finance minister succeeds in managing the challenges and the crisis.
Right.
And I've seen this whether it is Manmohan Singh or whether it is C.D. Deshmukh or whether it is T.T. Krishnamachari or even whether it is P. Chidambaram, and of course in the case of Arun Jaitley and Nirmala Sitharaman, the equation you have with the Prime Minister makes all the difference. I'll give one more example. See the difference between what happened to Mr. Yashwant Sinha vis-a-vis Mr. Jaswant Singh with Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. As long as Yashwant Sinha was there, whose relationship with the Prime Minister was not considered to be great, but the moment he changed and Jaswant Singh came, suddenly the finance ministry functioned with greater authority,
And
greater
vigor.
decisiveness and vigor, because Jaswant Singh had a better equation with the Prime Minister. So I think that's a very, very important factor in judging how well and how effective a finance minister has been.
Right. And now I know that your book is limited to the first 10 finance ministers and the next ones will come subsequently. But from the first 10, are there any lessons for the current finance minister? Are there any similarities with issues that the economy is facing right now versus what it faced back then? The pandemic notwithstanding, I mean, that's a once in a century thing.
I think one message which comes through very clearly is that finance ministers are not just economic policy makers. They are also a very important instrument of bringing about change in the political economy.
Right.
So they cannot be divorced from what is happening in the political front. So if you want to nationalize banks, your finance minister must be in tune with that reality.
Right.
I mean, Nehru made the mistake of pushing through his planning commission and saw his finance minister quit.
Right.
Whereas subsequently, I think Nehru learnt his lessons. He recognized the importance of taking the finance ministers on board as far as his political views or the political economy views are concerned. So I think the lessons that I would draw from the first 30 years of India after independence is that the finance ministers are not just economic policy makers, but they are an equal and equally important and powerful instrument in political economy issues.
Great, sir. And on that note, I will conclude this fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say I'm looking forward to the next 2 editions.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.